A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon. Juliet Smith from our sister station in Eugene spoke with one of the professors to learn more.
A dry cave in southern Oregon does not look like the kind of place that could break a century of textbooks. There is no gold glinting in the dirt, no dramatic skeleton frozen mid-stride, no obvious monument, just rock, dust, and silence. But inside that silence, a team of archaeologists found something that forced the entire field to quietly, reluctantly, admit it had gotten the story of the first Americans wrong. This is the story of how a handful of caves and one wind-scoured rock shelter in the Oregon High Desert became the place where the old timeline finally cracked open. For most of the 20th century, American schoolchildren learned a clean, simple story about how humans arrived on this continent. Around 13,000 years ago, small bands of hunters crossed a strip of land connecting Siberia to Alaska, exposed because so much of the planet's water was locked into glaciers. They walked south through a corridor that opened between two retreating ice sheets, and once they broke through, they found a continent with no other humans on it at all. These people carried a distinctive style of stone spear point, fluted down the center, so it could be mounted more securely on a wooden shaft. Archaeologists named that style after Clovis, New Mexico, where the points were first identified in the 1930s. The story became known as the Clovis First Model, and for decades it was treated less like a hypothesis and more like settled fact. The trouble is, settled facts have a way of not staying settled once people keep digging, and in the dry caves of south-central Oregon, that is exactly what happened. The Paisley Caves sit in a remote stretch of Lake County, Oregon, a series of rock shelters carved into an ancient lakeshore that dried up thousands of years ago. Archaeologists had known about the site since the early 20th century, but for decades nobody dug deep enough or carefully enough to challenge the accepted timeline. That changed when a University of Oregon team led by archaeologist Dennis Jenkins began systematically excavating the caves in the early 2000s. What they found was not a spectacular weapon or a carved totem. It was something far less glamorous and, in the end, far more convincing. Preserved human coprolites, essentially fossilized feces, dried and hardened in the arid cave sediment. It is easy to underestimate how valuable this kind of evidence is. A stone tool can tell you that a human hand shaped it, but it cannot tell you whose hand. A coprolite, if it survives intact, can preserve actual human DNA. And the desert climate of the Oregon Plateau, brutally dry and stable for thousands of years, had done what almost no other environment on Earth could do. It kept that organic material intact instead of letting it rot away. When researchers extracted and sequenced mitochondrial DNA from the coprolites, the results matched founding haplogroups associated with indigenous peoples of the Americas. This was not evidence of some failed migration that arrived and vanished without descendants. It was a direct genetic link to people alive today. The individuals who sheltered in those caves were not a dead end in the human story. Their lineage continued. Radiocarbon dating placed some of the material at more than 14,000 years old, calibrated, that is at least 1,000 years before the Clovis culture was believed to have arrived at all. The method used, accelerator mass spectrometry, dates the organic material itself rather than the surrounding soil, which sidesteps one of the most common objections to ancient sites, that artifacts simply slid down through disturbed layers of dirt over time. The Paisley Caves findings, published in the journal Science in 2008, were controversial from the moment they appeared. Some researchers raised legitimate concerns about possible contamination, since the coprolites had been handled and stored for years before the DNA analysis was performed. The debate over Paisley Caves has never fully resolved, and honest science communicators should say so plainly. But the site forced a reckoning that the field could no longer avoid, because 70 miles away, a second Oregon site was about to hand over evidence that did not depend on at all. Outside the small town of Riley in Harney County, in the high desert of eastern Oregon, sits a modest overhang known as Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter. University of Oregon archaeologist Patrick O'Grady has led excavations there since 2011, and for years the site offered little more than scattered obsidian flakes. This was not glamorous work. It was seasons of careful, unglamorous digging, sifting soil through screens, cataloging fragments that seemed at first unremarkable. What makes Rimrock Draw scientifically powerful is not any single artifact. It is a layer of white volcanic ash buried in the site's soil, which researchers matched to a documented eruption of Mount St. Helens roughly 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. Volcanic ash layers function as natural timestamps. Anything found beneath the ash predates the eruption. Anything above it came later. There is no ambiguity about which layer settled first, and no way to argue that an artifact simply slipped downward through disturbed sediment, because the ash itself forms a hard, continuous seal across the site. Beneath that ash layer, O'Grady's team recovered fragments of tooth enamel belonging to two extinct Ice Age species, Camelops, an ancient camel that once roamed western North America, and Bison antiquus, a larger ancestor of the modern American bison. Both species vanished from the fossil record thousands of years ago. Their presence beneath the ash placed them, at minimum, in the same window as the eruption. But the detail that mattered most was buried about 10 centimeters deeper than the animal remains. A single stone tool made of orange chalcedony worked into a multi-purpose implement with a curved cutting edge, a flat scraping surface, and a serrated edge. The serrated portion showed clear polish, the kind of wear that accumulates only through years of repeated use, sharpening, and resharpening. This was not a tool someone made and discarded within days. It was carried, maintained, and relied upon over a long stretch of a person's life. Because the tool sat deeper in the soil than the animal teeth, it was, by basic stratigraphic logic, older. When the animal remains were dated, the results came back between roughly 21,000 and 22,000 years old. O'Grady has been candid in public statements about how unsettling that number was and how he ran the dating process a second time on independent samples before he was willing to say so publicly. Both tests agreed. The tool itself belongs to what archaeologists call the Western-stemmed tradition, a distinct style of stone working with long blades and rounded, narrow bases. It looks nothing like a Clovis point, and importantly, current dating suggests some Western-stemmed tools are at least as old as or older than Clovis technology in parts of the West. That single fact undermines the old assumption that every ancient tool-making tradition in the Americas descended from Clovis as the founding technology. If a distinct style was already established before or alongside Clovis, it points toward multiple, separate technological traditions arriving or developing independently, not one single point of origin. Long before Oregon's caves made headlines, a much quieter, much more contentious battle had already been fought on the other side of the country. In the 1970s, archaeologist James Ottavasio began excavating a sandstone rock shelter in southwestern Pennsylvania called Meadowcroft, situated along a small tributary of the Ohio River. As Ottavasio's team dug deeper, layer by layer, the radiocarbon dates kept pushing further back than the Clovis first model allowed. By the time he published his findings in American Antiquity in 1980, he was arguing for human occupation as early as 16,000 to 19,000 years ago, calibrated thousands of years before Clovis. The response from much of the archaeological establishment was not curiosity, it was resistance, sometimes bordering on hostility. Some colleagues suggested contamination from coal deposits in the region might have skewed the radiocarbon results, since coal can introduce old carbon into a sample and make it appear artificially ancient. Others simply declined to engage with the paper at all. Researchers later coined a phrase for the stubborn defense of the old model in the face of mounting contrary evidence: Clovis first orthodoxy. Even decades later, surveys of working archaeologists found the field still split, with a meaningful share of researchers unconvinced or openly skeptical of Meadowcroft's dates, despite the site's long survival in the literature. Meadowcroft matters here because it shows that Oregon was not the first crack in the Clovis first wall. It was one crack among several, but it landed at a moment when the field, worn down by decades of accumulating anomalies, was finally ready to take the evidence seriously instead of dismissing it outright. while Oregon's caves and rock shelters were quietly rewriting the timeline from the north. An entirely different kind of evidence was surfacing in the gypsum flats of White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico. In 2009, researchers noticed unusual impressions pressed into the pale, hardened ground of what had once been the shoreline of ancient Lake Otero. Careful excavation eventually revealed dozens of human footprints, some belonging to children, others to adults moving quickly across the mud. This is a strikingly intimate kind of evidence. A stone tool tells you someone made something. A footprint tells you someone was there, walking, on an ordinary day, alongside an Ice Age lake. Researchers dated the footprints using seeds from an aquatic plant, Rupia serosa, found in the same sediment layers, producing dates between roughly 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. Skeptics raised a fair concern. Aquatic plants can absorb old carbon from groundwater, which can make radiocarbon dates appear older than they actually are. It was a legitimate scientific challenge, and the research team responded the way good science is supposed to. They tested again, using conifer pollen from the same layers, which does not carry the same groundwater contamination risk. The results matched. A third study, published in 2023, added dating from quartz grains in the sediment itself using an entirely different method called optically stimulated luminescence, and again arrived at a similar window. 3 independent lines of evidence, each vulnerable to different potential errors, converging on the same range, is about as strong a case as archaeology can offer. And the footprints did not appear in isolation. They were found alongside tracks left by Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, animals that vanished from North America thousands of years ago, preserved in the same ancient mud, at what appears to be roughly the same window of time. The White Sands evidence places people on the continent during the height of the last ice age, well before the supposed opening of any ice-free corridor. No honest account of this topic can skip past one of the most explosive and most disputed claims in the field, the Cerruti Mastodon site in San Diego County, California, in 1992. A highway construction crew uncovered mastodon bones during roadwork. Paleontologists who examined the remains found spiral fractures in the bone, a pattern that some researchers argue only occurs in fresh bone rather than bone that has already fossilized, and several large stone cobbles nearby that appeared, to the excavation team, to be out of place given the surrounding geology. In 2017, a team led by Stephen Holen, Kathleen Holen, Thomas Demmer, and Richard Fulligar published uranium-thorium dating on the bone in the journal Nature, producing an age of approximately 130,000 years. If the bones had genuinely been broken by human or hominin activity at that age, it would place some early human relative in North America more than 100,000 years before every other piece of evidence discussed here. It is important to be direct about where the scientific community actually stands on this claim, rather than presenting it as settled. The overwhelming majority of archaeologists have not accepted the Cerruti interpretation. Many argue the spiral fractures and cobble placement can be explained by natural geological processes, such as heavy machinery or even prehistoric trampling and sediment compaction, without requiring any human presence at all. The paper generated significant pushback specifically because it offered no supporting evidence of hominins in the Americas at that age from any other site, no other artifacts, no other tools, nothing corroborating such an enormous claim. As of now, most researchers treat the Cerruti site as unresolved and highly controversial, not as an accepted marker of ancient human presence. It is included here, not as proof, but as an honest illustration of how contested this field remains, even after Oregon's findings forced a broader reconsideration of the old timeline. Hashtag rethinking how people got here at all if the oldest tools in Oregon do not resemble Clovis technology, and if people were apparently present in North America thousands of years before any ice-free corridor would have existed. The old picture of a single overland migration starts to look incomplete at best. Genetic research tracing a mitochondrial lineage known as D4H3A has suggested a coastal migration route following the Pacific shoreline from Northeast Asia down through what is now British Columbia and into the Americas, potentially by watercraft, moving gradually along the coast rather than crossing an interior ice corridor on foot. This idea, sometimes called the coastal migration hypothesis, has gained substantial support in recent decades, partly because archaeological sites along the Pacific Northwest coast, including on islands off British Columbia, have produced evidence of human presence dating back roughly 14,000 years, in some cases in locations that would only make sense if people were already comfortable navigating along coastlines and around islands. This does not mean everyone arrived by boat, and it does not mean the traditional overland route is entirely wrong. It is likely that multiple groups arrived through multiple routes across different periods, some by coastal travel, some later through interior corridors once they opened. The tidy, single-arrow migration map that generations of students memorized was always an oversimplification. Oregon's evidence alongside Meadowcroft, White Sands, and the ongoing debate over sites like Cerruti is part of what finally pushed the field to admit that the real story was always going to be more complicated, more layered, and frankly, more interesting than one heroic crossing over a frozen bridge. Why Oregon specifically mattered it is worth pausing on why Paisley Caves and Rimrock Draw carried so much weight when other sites had raised similar questions for decades. Part of it is method. Paisley Caves offered genetic evidence directly connecting an ancient individual to living indigenous populations, closing the gap between someone old was here and these are documented ancestors of people alive today. Rimrock Draw offered something rarer still, a natural, undisputed geological marker, a volcanic ash layer that made stratigraphic arguments about contamination or disturbed layers far harder to sustain. Together, the two sites reinforced each other. One offered biological continuity, the other offered geological certainty, and both arrived at a moment when researchers like O'Grady were willing to publish results they personally found unsettling, understanding the professional risk that comes with challenging a paradigm that had shaped careers, museum exhibits, and textbooks for the better part of a century. What actually changed none of this means archaeologists have thrown out everything they thought they knew. Clovis technology is real, well documented, and remains an important part of the story of ancient North America. What has changed is the claim that Clovis people were the first humans on the continent, arriving through a single overland route into an empty landscape. The evidence from Oregon, reinforced by Meadowcroft, White Sands, and ongoing coastal migration research, points instead toward a longer, messier, more layered story. People appear to have been present in North America for at least 20,000 years, likely arriving in multiple waves, through multiple routes, carrying multiple distinct tool-making traditions. The Western stem tradition found at Rimrock Draw stands as evidence of one of those separate lineages, developing on its own terms rather than descending from Clovis technology. This is not a story about erasing everything the old model got right. It is a story about a field slowly, sometimes reluctantly, correcting itself as better evidence and better dating methods became available. That is not a weakness in archaeology. It is exactly how good science is supposed to work, even when the people who spent their careers defending the old answer find the correction uncomfortable. Rimrock Draw is still being excavated. Paisley Caves has not been fully explored, and archaeologists across the American West continue to look at sites once dismissed as unremarkable with fresh eyes, wondering what else might be sitting beneath a layer of ash or dried into the floor of a forgotten cave, waiting for someone patient enough to dig deep enough to find it. The story of the first Americans is not finished. It was never going to fit neatly into a single museum diorama or a single arrow drawn across a map. What Oregon's caves and rock shelters revealed is that the real history of this continent runs older, stranger, and more complicated than anyone was willing to admit for most of the last 100 years. And somewhere out in that same high desert, the next piece of the story is almost certainly still buried, waiting for the next person willing to keep digging.